The national turbulence of the past 12 months has prompted many of us to look at American history in a very different way. There are times when the past mirrors the present as an actual event or even as a suppressed memory. One example is the race massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. A documentary about the massacre will be shown Monday night on PBS. Our guest is the writer for the documentary, a Tulsa native who worked many years on news outlets here, including on WGBH TV and the Boston Globe. We'd like to welcome Carmen Fields. Thank you very much for being with us, Carmen.
Thank you for asking.
Carmen, I want to start with the sort of the bigger picture here, because for people who don't know the story of the massacre with the 300 people who were killed, it sounds like a unique event, but it was also very characteristic of the time and country where it happened. So give us some of that background.
Well, many people talk about what's now known as Red Summer, which was the time between, I believe, 1919, 1921, where in St. Louis, I believe Nashville, other cities around the nation, there were racially motivated riots. And each of them had a different genesis, but probably the most horrific was the one that was in Tulsa.
And this is a time when the fever, not only of racism, but xenophobia in this country was running pretty high.
Mhm. Indeed. And you couple that with the fact that Tulsa at the time was the seat of what became known as Black Wall Street. Very numerous, flourishing business community, entrepreneurship, all manner of hotels, cafes, bowling alleys, not bowling alleys, pool halls, theaters, and the like flourished in this area of Greenwood. And it's given that resulted in some jealousies, some petty jealousies that led to the destruction of the community.
This was almost like a very self-contained economy and prosperity too. I mean, how did that happen?
Well, wiser minds than mine, but the notion that entrepreneurs built a business, and because of segregation, it was self-contained, so the dollars turned over several times in that community, as opposed to going to the shopping mall and getting earrings at the jewelry store and getting something else at another establishment and your shoes at a different shoe store. All of that was contained in the Greenwood community, haberdasheries, drugstores, the whole like. So that same dollar that started in one place turned over several times in that community.
Well, this was destroyed very, very quickly by a white rampage. There was a momentary trigger for that in a way, but there was also something that sort of set the stage for it on a large scale. What was that?
Uh, a young man was, an African-American man, went into a store elevator, and there was a white elevator operator. And apparently Dick Rowland either stumbled or fell and brushed against the white elevator operator, who took offense to that. And by the time the story got around, it was that she had been attacked. And he was arrested, taken to jail, and then word spread that there was going to be a lynching. And the men of the African-American community took up arms to prevent that from happening. And the rest, shall we say, is history. Who knows who fired the first shot or what happened? That's murky. But next thing you knew, torches and gunfire, and the whole, I think, a 35 block area of Tulsa and the heart of its entrepreneurial community, as well as many homes and luxurious homes by 1920, 21 standards, were destroyed.
Well, the fear of lynching in this case, it was hardly paranoia because if you look at the size of the membership in the Ku Klux Klan just in Oklahoma, that was pretty big.
Indeed. It was one of the places where it did flourish in particular. And let me back up a minute to explain to your audience that this is not a story exclusively about the massacre of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, although it is a major part of the documentary, the film. The nexus or the genesis or premise of the story originally was a look at the interior of segregation. And the executive producer at the time, who had I hatched the idea with, wanted to look at segregation in a kind of any place USA, and not Nashville, not Mississippi, not some of the household names in terms of race animus, and happened to serendipitously listen to some of my stories about growing up in segregation. And these stories did not include the race massacre. But when we delved into it and she appointed Sam Pollard and Joyce Vaughn as the producers, it was a matter of, we can't ignore this. And so that was added as a part of, an integral part of the story of segregation, how people lived under it, and how they achieved, because Tulsa was rebuilt, or Greenwood was rebuilt after the massacre.
Yes, it was a story of resilience, but I'm also wondering, you grew up in Tulsa. How much of this story did you know as a kid, and how much of it was held back from you?
Not, I knew very little. I have some repressed memories of perhaps it being mentioned, but the extent that I learned in working on this documentary about it, it does not compare. It was something that was very much suppressed. I don't know whether it was a matter of shame or still an abiding fear. But even after the documentary was shown in Tulsa, at some audiences, I would get the question, why do you want to bring that stuff up anymore? Why, leave that alone. Why do we have to hear about that? So there was still, even in 1993, when it was first broadcast, a reticence or an unwillingness of people in Tulsa and in other places to really come to grips with what had happened.
Well, you and I being news people, we know how easy it is to really focus on the sensational. But when I watched this documentary, what I was also maybe even more struck by was the people you talked to, the people who were telling the story, people who were taking charge of their history and relocating the center of the universe. What was that like for you?
A very emotional and special time, because part of my duties as a writer, and I guess in a sense a co-producer, was finding these what we call witnesses. And so I went back to my church community, my teachers, my classmates, my brother's classmates, elected officials, to try and get a number of witnesses or people with different points of view to tell the story of Tulsa and segregation.
One of the things that's also, I almost feel like I'm a spoiler here because what happens in this history later on beyond World War II, with the onset of desegregation in this country, was that this is one thing that was more difficult for Greenwood, that is the African-American section of Tulsa, to survive. It's almost like there were regrets about desegregation. I was wondering, I thought that might have been pushed a little too far, but how do you feel about it?
Well, there are pluses and minuses of the experience. Even today, I get my hometown newspaper, the Black newspaper, where I got my journalistic start, as a matter of fact, the Oklahoma Eagle. And from time to time, there are articles or stories about the difficulty that Black entrepreneurs are having getting a toehold in Greenwood these years. There's only, I believe it's two of the original businesses that were on Greenwood, dating back to at least the 40s, that are still in existence, and they're in that Greenwood community. But now many of the entrepreneurs and businesses of color have been co-opted by other investors and entrepreneurs that in some instances charge rents for their buildings or properties that are out of reach for some of the Black businesses. So there are pluses and minuses. Yes, you can go anywhere, you can eat in any restaurant, you can go to any bank, you can get a loan, you can live anywhere, but there are also some downsides to the notion of integration.
Well, if you're looking at this documentary again, in light of what we've been living through in this country for the past year, or even the invasion of the Capitol building last month, does that change your take on this at all in some way?
Well, they're different stories, but it's what hasn't changed is the notion of mob violence and mob rule and unwillingness to accept the humanity of one another. And that is the question for the ages, or the problem for the ages, whether it's racially motivated, whether it's politically motivated. This notion of mob rule is what I find the most distressing.
Well, finally, Carmen, we should mention viewers will have a chance to see this on Monday. What time is this coming on Monday night?
9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, and WGBH, and I believe that's channel 2, and I believe channel 44 will be carrying it as well.
Well, thank you very much for reminding us and prompting us to take another look at the history.
Thank you so much, Chris, and keep up the fine work that you do, sharing the stories of our communities.
Well, thank you very much. Great storyteller, spending your time with us. Thank you. Carmen Fields. We'll have more news in just a moment.